Chapter 21, Red on Red. By now, I'd given almost 6 committed years of my life to this movement and still believed that the cause was well founded on a righteous and dignified purpose. I considered myself to be a true believer and was still inspired by the NF and what it squarely represented. However, I became cognizant of the obvious changes that began to manifest within the NR and the Norteño following. At the time, I didn't understand what it was or why it was happening, but a lot of Norteños began dropping out and walking away from the cause. This inevitably was the beginning stages of the self-destructing process. The NF created the NR as an auxiliary force to continue pushing its agenda and vision on the main lines forward, and this movement prospered. However, a number of highly influential rogue NR members began thinking that they were vested with the authority to make significant decisions themselves. Without any checks and balances and without guidance from the NF, some of these NR members began victimizing and preying on the non-affiliated Norteños for personal reasons or self-gain. These abusements became prevalent and commonfold throughout the ranks, either behind women, neighborhood disputes, set tripping, personality clashes, or favoritism. A lot of Norteños began falling victim to their tyranny and felt the wrath of these wayward NR members. I started calling it the Wolfpack Syndrome. Instead of showing the non-affiliated Norteños carnalismo, brotherism, and embracing them, these NR members were jumping on the first opportunity to pounce on them and rip them to pieces, just as a pack of wolves would do when one of their own loses its footing and falls to the ground. They began turning on and preying upon these Norteños, pushing them out and driving them away. A lot of these NR members began developing a mentality of superiority simply because they were committed, or they thought they were better or smarter, or they had more tattoos than some of these other guys. They became so heavy-handed that they even took away their voices. In the past, Norteños were encouraged to use their voices or to speak up when they saw an area that could use improvement. We were always open to bringing new ideas to the table or asking questions if something was not understood. But now they were made to feel like they were going against the grain or bucking the system if they spoke up. Other NR members began openly using drugs on the main lines and no longer felt as if they had to participate or engage when a conflict developed. They were outright abusing their positions, and this discouraged a lot of Norteños. They began fearing their own people. Some Norteños on the streets even began to see the NF and the R as an interloper that put business ahead of the neighborhood. They looked at their associations with their neighborhood as a form of tribal loyalty that shouldn't be subordinate to the dictates of a prison gang. When I first began getting funneled through the ad sags back in the late 1980s to early 1990s, it was a rarity to come across more than 5 to 10 bona fide DOs, dropouts, in a whole block or unit. It just wasn't that common to encounter a DO back then. Most of them were skilled NF dropouts, but were still treated with a measure of caution, as some of these individuals would kill you if given the chance. But now, toward the mid-90s, these numbers began to increase with astonishing rapidity. CDC began to clear out whole tiers to make room for these guys who were cut from a different breed. The majority of them were youngsters. In the past, you could look at any BNL bad news list and clearly see that these were older NF members with old CDC numbers. But now, these guys were kids who weren't lasting any more than a couple years, and this became a consistent trend. They were no longer feared and were now considered wimps, punks, and heartless cowards. The morale within the Norteño following also began to flounder. It was evident. There was a lot of backbiting and detraction. Sides were being chosen and loyalty lines were drawn. Loyalty in itself became suspect, and we later take notice of this. One of the first measures we took was to scrap the broken category system that was used to grade the NR members. From the onset, this implementation was an unforeseeable oversight, as it actually invited dissidents. NR members were simply claiming that they were of the highest grade, but there were no viable methods to effectively cross-check their claims. Scrapping the system was instituted to level the playing field and to preclude any NR members from feigning that they held more status than others. This had little or no effect, and the perfidiousness had already set in. Mandates were beginning to flow out of the Bay, admonishing any perpetrators and forewarning them of the dire consequences. But even that was sloughed over and ignored. Some of these mandates referred to this beleaguered infighting as red-on-red violence, norteños fighting norteños. Norteños were being severely admonished for continuing to perpetrate these conflicts and were being warned to cease these actions or face serious consequences. Inter-street gang warfare didn't really become a problem for norteños until around the mid-90s when these conflicts began spilling over into the NR. Some NR members who now held positions and influence began using their status as a means to get back at those they were beefing with on the streets. A lot of the non-affiliated Northerners were now becoming targets and were being victimized by these NR members who held status above them. Whether it was behind neighborhood rivalries, personality clashes, favoritism, women, or other personal issues, the NR members were abusing their authority and victimizing them. A number of these mandates covered a vast area of new revisions, all aimed at improving the anomalies that began surfacing within the Norteño movement. But one of these mandates, referred to as El Norte Law, was actually counterproductive and resulted in even more detraction by the non-affiliated Norteños. This edict mandated that every Northern Hispanic in the state of California who wore the color red and who considered themselves to be Northerners or Norteños now fell directly under the umbrella of the NF authority. In theory, this was already well established, and these young Norteños already knew this, but this was more about mandating them to similar obligations and responsibilities that up until that point had only been imposed on the affiliated NR members. NF leadership felt that these non-affiliated Norteños should be held to function at a higher level since they were enjoying the same luxuries and privileges as the NF and the NR. But this particular implementation pushed a lot of Norteños away, as they now felt as if the NF was imposing its weight on them and forcing them to function at the same capacity as the NR. It was also being pointed out that some of our neighborhoods were being invaded and overran by sureños. They were implanting themselves and spreading like a nomadic epidemic. Therefore, it was time to begin banding together to combat a problem that we were all responsible for allowing to metastasize. Although the NF forbids its members from participating in any type of gangbanging, it does recognize the need to use Norteño-based street gangs to combat this problem, and this was encouraged. Squads of NR members were actually being sent back out to the streets with directives to begin unifying these street gangs to orchestrate attacks against the sureños. But the red-on-red infighting needed to be quashed first, and the enigma was already becoming deeply rooted and ensconced within the movement. Some of the self-proclaimed hardline NR members began to arrogate that they no longer had to conform to the wills and edicts of the NF, and that they were now a separate entity. They were actually denouncing the NF and the direction it was taking. This spurred the NF to take an even more aggressive approach, and now it was actively targeting and weeding out the palpable culprits. The movement was now mechanically operating like a besieged ecosystem, preying and feeding off of its own people. The movement became so racked with infighting and dissidents that it was nearly rudderless and moribund. But I wasn't about to let this weaken or enfeeble my own resolve. I skeptically looked the other way and continued pushing on. I had to assume that our leadership was moving in the right direction and that these complicit intricacies would be purged. I paroled from San Quentin in October of 1995 and was picked up at the front gate by a homeboy of mine, Sal Navarrete from San Francisco. Sal had paroled a month prior. Our first stop was a liquor store in Marin. I jumped out and grabbed a 40 ounce of Mickey's malt liquor. Beer always helped me unwind and ease my nerves when I got out. When we finally made it to San Francisco, Sal dropped me off a block away from Connie's mom's apartment on 15th and Mission. I went straight to a payphone to call her and let her know I was just around the corner. Unfortunately, the first thing I did before dialing her number was set the envelope with my gate money in it on top of the phone. All I was thinking about was seeing my daughter. But the Mickeys had me feeling so good that I forgot all about the envelope after I hung up and walked away. Big old dummy. By the time I realized that I forgot the envelope, I went back to the phone, but somebody had already found it. I felt like such a dumbass when I told Connie what happened. All my gate money was gone. Of course, being near Skid Row, I figured a dope fiend was either getting ready to buy a fat ass sack or some wino was gearing up to go on a serious drinking binge. When I finally got to her apartment, I remember walking in and seeing my daughter for the first time. Connie looked at me and said, "There's your daughter, pick her up." She was so tiny, with a head full of her mom's thick black hair. She was a beautiful, adorable baby, lying in her bassinet all dressed up. I remember thinking how much she resembled her mother. Having a beautiful, brand new baby girl should have changed my outlook on life and should have pushed me in a better direction. But once again, it didn't take long for things to sour between me and my parole officer. Once that happened, I fell into another tailspin. In January 1996, Loquito paroled from San Quentin and showed up at our apartment one night with his parole box. I took him to another homeboy's house by the name of Steve Porky Lent from Daly City and convinced him to let Loquito stay there for the next 2 weeks. After Porky's family took issue with Loquito staying there, Connie surprisingly convinced her mom to let Loquito stay with us at her apartment in a small extra room. I was shocked and never would have thought her mom would have ever agreed to an arrangement like this, but she did and he moved in. Over the next couple of weeks, me and Loquito began selling heroin and powder cocaine on 16th and Mission to generate money for the regiment and to support ourselves. Meanwhile, I continued writing Big Roach and Conejo to keep them abreast of what I was doing and to maintain steady contact with them. One night while drinking, I got into an argument with Connie and deliberately walked outside looking for trouble. As I walked across the street to the Walmart parking lot, I spotted two guys wearing Dallas Cowboy jerseys with the number 13 stenciled real big across their backs. They were definitely sureños. All I thought about was that these fools needed to be taught a lesson for openly disrespecting my neighborhood and acting like they could walk around with nothing to worry about. This was Northern California, and these sureños had the audacity to flag their colors as if they were walking around in the middle of East LA. They were infesting our streets and invading our neighborhoods like a teeming colony of cockroaches. All my encounters and fury with them was about to boil over on these two individuals in front of me. Without saying a word, I pulled out my box cutter, walked up to them, slashed the first one's throat, and cut the other one across the cheek. I caught them by complete surprise. The one who got his throat slit dropped to the ground almost immediately, and the other one tried to take off running, but he was too slow. I caught up to him and got him again from the top of his head all the way down to the back of his neck. Then I went back to the other one who had gotten up and tried staggering into Cragen's directly next door to Walgreens. As he stumbled through the doors, I grabbed the back of his jersey and pulled him back outside, where I got him again across the side of his cheek. There was blood everywhere. It probably looked worse than what it really was because of the amount of blood, but I did make a hideous mess out of these guys. Without thinking, I snatched the chain off the guy, turning it into another robbery. As soon as I made it back across the street into the apartment, the cops were already at the front gate ringing the doorbell. Not knowing anything had happened, I heard Connie's mom open the front door and look down the stairs. The cops had to be buzzed in the security gate in order to get into the apartment. Now I could clearly hear them yelling, "Open up the fucking door right now. Police." Adrenaline pumping, I ran out the back door, down the stairs, and started jumping fences. I hit 2 fences and ended up underneath the complex where the garbage cans were lined up. I was boxed in. There was nowhere else for me to go except out a door that led back to the street where flashing police lights could be seen. I opened up one of the garbage cans and dropped the box cutter inside, making sure it fell to the bottom. Then I opened up another can and dumped the necklace. In the meantime, the cops made their way into the apartment and were coming down the back stairs searching for me. I could see the flashlights, and at one point they actually got within a few feet of where I was but missed me. After waiting for about 2 hours, I came out and went back upstairs. Needless to say, Connie's mom was livid. She was furious. She was an older, traditional type of Mexican lady who barely spoke English and went to church every Sunday. She was a devout, law-abiding citizen and didn't like the idea of cops running through her apartment and ransacking her personal belongings, all on account of me. Our relationship was already strained behind me and Connie constantly fighting, but for her mom, this was the last straw. She told me I had to go. She said I was too much trouble and could no longer stay. Both me and Loquito. What could I say? I had no argument. I knew I fucked up and had disrespected her, and I couldn't hold it against her. I didn't want to stay there anymore anyway. The cops took a picture of me that Connie had and found my name and CDC number on an old letter I had mailed to her from prison. They told Connie they were going to call my parole officer and tell him what happened. It was already after midnight, and Connie convinced her mom to let me stay the night and leave early in the morning. The next morning, I had Connie and her sister Letitia walk across the street and talk to the employees at Walgreens and Craigan's to see what they could find out. I wanted to see how much trouble I was in and possibly see if these guys I assaulted had given statements about me. From what they were able to gather, someone called the police from a cell phone, but the two victims left the scene and never talked to the cops. That was a good sign, but the cops were still looking for me and they knew who I was. Hopefully, parole was all I had to worry about. Later that day, Loquito and I left the apartment and rented a cheap room at a hotel on 16th and Valencia. Over the next couple weeks, we continued selling heroin and cocaine, moving from one cheap hotel to another. Both of us were now running from parole, so we didn't make a habit out of staying at one spot for too long. I eventually started using again and became trapped in my heroin addiction. Instead of netting a profit, I was now just spinning my wheels trying to support my habit and make ends meet. Although I tried to conceal my addiction from everyone around me, I knew Connie and Loquito knew what I was doing whenever I stepped into a bathroom and disappeared for 20 to 30 minutes at a time. During the last couple of weeks that I was out, I reluctantly moved Connie and my daughter in with me in one of these rundown hotel rooms. I didn't want to do it, and it was probably one of the worst choices I ever made in my life, but Connie wanted to be with me and wanted to be out of her mother's apartment. It was a bad move. I was strung out and falling off the deep end, and I knew my time was running out. I kept promising Connie I'd get clean and turn myself in. I was tired of running and didn't want to see them live like that, but it never happened. One day turned into 2 days turned into a week, and I kept putting it off. In February 1996, I was finally arrested and transported to the county jail in downtown San Francisco. After picking up a spurious assault case, I spent the next 5 months fighting the case until I finally pled out to my second strike. I took a 4-year deal for assault with a deadly weapon and actually got lucky. Technically, they could have struck me out because I had already been convicted of 3 robberies in 1989. But at the time the DA made the offer, she hadn't received my file from San Mateo County and had no idea I'd been convicted of 2 other robberies besides the one in San Francisco they had on file. For this reason and a contingent of others, I opted to avoid a messy trial. It put Connie in an undesirable predicament, for they were trying to force her to testify against me. They threatened to take our daughter away from us if she didn't, so I just pled out and took the time. During the entire 5 months that I was there in the jail, I stayed loaded on heroin. I became savvy at devising different methods to have it smuggled into the jail and always kept at least an ounce on me. I either manipulated attorneys, jail deputies, or had it coming in through the mail. At one point, I had whole ounces coming in almost weekly, secreted in magazines. This method actually worked for a long time. Someone would eventually tell on me and give up my system for bringing it in. But by that time, I was already getting ready to catch a bus back to prison anyway. I remember having everyone in my tank strung out. It should have been obvious to the tier officers because every other tank on our tier would still be asleep at 6 o'clock in the morning when the mail came in. But my tank was the only tank where everyone was up walking around with their beds made and carrying eye drop bottles full of heroin. When they finally did come in with drug-sniffing canines and a search team, it was too late, and they caught me at one of the unusual times when I was dry. I finally caught the bus back to San Quentin in August of 1996. I went back to the Adjustment Center, AC, where NF leader Mike MC Castillo was on his last few months of a parole violation. Another NF member also serving a parole violation was Salvador Littleman Castaneda from Salinas. As soon as I got back on a tier, I was looked out for by death row inmates in the same fashion that I'd always been every time I went through there. I usually landed on a tier where there were either BGF, Black Guerrilla family members, who were on the Northern Mexican Northern Black Yard, or another Northerner, but this time there was nobody on the tier with me. However, even though the Mexican Mafia members, the Aryan Brotherhood members, and the Sureños were considered my arch enemies, we still always looked out for each other in situations like this, and this was just a common thread of respect. It was a strict convict code that was honored and shared by those of us who were considered real convicts and who placed a high emphasis on mutual decorum. These guys were looking at the death penalty and fighting for their lives. They didn't waste time muddling with that north-south inanity. If given the opportunity, we tried to take each other's wind, and that went without saying. But the small immaterial things such as hygiene, coffee, or reading material were just considered inconsequential. Hector Ayala, his brother Ronnie Ayala, Chato Sandoval from Maravilla, Carlos Medina, and another Samoan Sureño they called Smokey were the ones I frequently ran into. If I landed on a tier with any of these guys, they'd send me everything I needed, almost as if I was one of their homeboys. These were all stand-up guys whom I held a lot of respect for. The fact that they spent their existence waiting to be executed and had the ability to maintain equanimity under the circumstances was worthy of my respect in itself. Some of these guys on death row eventually ended up deteriorating and succumbing to this deplorable existence. I witnessed this myself. In fact, when I returned to the AC in August 1996, one of my immediate neighbors was one of the hapless victims of this sinking retrogression. A few years earlier, when I first started going through the adjustment center, I met a Crip named Pablo Watkins, who was about my age. We used to kick it on the tier all the time, talking about the streets, sharing personal pictures, and just passing the time. But as time went on, Pablo began developing all the characteristics of someone consumed with schizophrenia. He thought the tier officers were tampering with his mail, playing with his food, and then he took it a step further. He bombed on one of his homeboys they called Little Money because Pablo apparently thought that him and the other Crips on the yard with him were plotting against him. When I left the first time, Pablo weighed about 260 pounds. He was fat and never worked out. But when they came by to run showers that night, they went to cuff up my neighbor who hadn't spoken a word to me since I had arrived. I was curious to see who it was because whoever he was, he coughed and hacked all day like he had a deep lung infection or something. When the door opened up and I got a good look at who it was, I couldn't believe what I saw. It was Pablo, who now weighed about 110 pounds soaking wet. He looked sick, not just physically but mentally. He walked by and greeted me, but the blank look on his face told me that he was no longer in control of himself. He lost it. I felt so uncomfortable when I looked at him that it almost felt like I was witnessing something I wasn't supposed to be seeing. The guy was my age, and it was just disheartening to see him like that.